Hi everyone, I'm Temeko Richardson for The Sports Life. I'm joined today with my friend Tre Johnson, a former NFL offensive lineman. Today our topic of discussion will be about athletes going broke. One of the things that we see with athletes, we've also seen the documentary on ESPN, Broke, and one of the things that seems to be a trend is athletes going broke. And from a business perspective, what usually happens is an entrepreneur builds a business plan. Do you think it's necessary for an athlete to build a business plan as soon as they get signed to identify how the money is going to be dished out, what kind of emergency planning needs to happen in case you're injured? What do you think about that?
I think that's an excellent idea. I think it's extremely appropriate for any NFL or professional athlete in general to have a business plan that kind of consolidates where their resources are coming from and how they're going to be spent or planned for in the future. I think having that business plan, or at least having someone who can implement one on their behalf, is a necessity in today's world of professional athletes.
Now, you mentioned having the right person to be able to do that. So maybe some of the people don't understand watching us that there is a difference between an agent, a business manager, and a financial manager. Can you explain how you were able to handle all three of those entities within your years in the NFL?
Well, there's a saying, it takes a village to raise a child. Mm-hmm. And I think when you have the majority of professional athletes, when they come into the fortune of being professional athletes and finally get exposed to some level of income, some level of real money, they're new to it. They don't necessarily have the financial background, the socialization process that has put them around a great deal of money, funds, from a generation to generation perspective, where they're trained to manage large sums of money by the time they become professional athletes. So that village, like you said before, your agent, your financial planner, your tax accountant, all of these people, in my opinion, should be separate entities. That whole checks and balances thing, if it's all one person, which I think has happened when you talk about that 30 for 30 of going broke, people don't go broke by buying like solid gold Cadillacs and limos and things like that. That is foolish to do. What ends up happening is usually some poor financial decision by horrible representation that mismanages a great deal of their money, and they're stuck trying to catch up while playing in a world or a business that's very finite financially. So with the proper people in place, a system, a business plan, if you will, in place to kind of regulate how they're going to spend the rest of their lives, I think those are the athletes you see a little more successful at the end of their careers and being able to transition into a normal life, even become entrepreneurs in other areas. I mean, I think that's very important.
Well, you mentioned the fact that it is a finite time in terms of making money. And a lot of professional athletes don't understand that it is really an opportunity to be able to play a sport that they really like. It is not necessarily a career. Now, if you're fortunate enough to make it in whatever the league is, 9, 10 years, clearly that's somewhat of a career. And you can turn that career into something more profitable by doing prosperous business deals that make sense. And we've seen as spectators is the whole, they buy rims, they're buying the Gucci belts, they have the 10-carat diamond earring. I mean, where does all that come from?
Well, I think that comes from our consumer-based society. They didn't make these things that you mentioned just for athletes. Mm-hmm. The thing about it is, it's emphasized that these things are a symbol of making it, of achieving that level of wealth or the good life, if you will. And our society presses that. We are a society, you hear it in every hip hop song, they're freely advertising some form of paraphernalia that is necessity to be balling, to be making it. And I think that athletes wrongly, without having that financial foundation, aspire to being that, and not understanding that a lot of the people who are truly wealthy are coming from generations of wealth. So it's the misconception of what wealth really is that affects a lot of the athletes that are new to having money. And then once they get the money, I think they wrongly, maybe misguidedly spend it in some of these avenues that are not necessarily in their best benefit for long-term financial gain. And I think that's a problem. I think, though, from a percentage standpoint, if you look holistically on all the entrepreneurs, when they were brand new entrepreneurs and business people, they too made some mistakes. The thing was, they had opportunities or maybe the financial support to outlast some of their financial downfalls, some of the pitfalls and foolish mistakes they made to become wealthy after they made a mistake. athletes, because it is such a finite time period of making money, if they make that big mistake and it's not really early in their careers, it can be detrimental for the remainder of their life, even in their sport and beyond. And it's a young man's game. If you can make it into your 30s playing a sport, that's a hell of a career. But you still maybe, hopefully, are living another 40 years, 45 years after that, where you have to provide, exist in a very competitive, westernized society. So if you're not truly built or trained on how to do that and given the opportunity to outlast some of your pitfalls, this is where you see people going broke.
Well, I think, women, we all know that we do this. We buy the shoes, we have the bags, we have all of the necessities that we believe make us feel good, and they could make us feel good from a perspective, a female perspective, and looking good whenever we go out. But there's also the need to also have the Gucci bags, the Louis Vuitton bags, the Louis Vuitton shoes, and things of that nature. So like you said, it's not just an athlete thing.
No.
It's across the board. And one of the key things, though, that's different, I believe, for regular workers versus athletes is that we kind of know when our job is about to end. We either have a contract or we have a long-term type of employment. For an athlete, especially for someone who is signed to like a one-year deal, or they're undrafted and they sign, that's totally different. They can be cut at any time. So if they're spending money like that, what ends up happening is that they are always trying to chase to get the next check in order to recoup the money that they've spent. So what are some advice that you could possibly give to some of those types of athletes?
I don't know if we have enough time, but for starters, I would say don't plan on spending any money you don't have in your hand. Mm-hmm. I think it's okay to go slow. We don't necessarily have to jump into the markets right away, try to be the next E.F. Hutton or some masterful investor in things that we don't understand. But I think you can split that into a reasonable distribution of your wealth where you're still planning for long-term gain, long-term stability, and having a good time with it. And hopefully, as you continue to play, you can fund these two sides of your financial portfolio to make sure you're always in existence as long, or reasonable existence, as long as you are living at a level that's maintainable after football. And you have to plan that way. Don't try to live on the Bill Gates level, which is incredibly impossible for most athletes, if any. And then when it's over, you got to go back to the project or something like that. That's not what it is. It's a happy medium you have to find.
Well, you're saying that people shouldn't live beyond their means.
Don't live beyond their means.
That's American consumerism, and that's why the government is now trying to raise the ceiling debt, because we're just over. We just overspend.
So it's not just athletes.
It's not just athletes. No, it's totally the American way. I know from owning a business, and we go out from a technology consulting perspective, is that when we go to assignments, and let's just say the contract has included in it expenses, so that's a certain amount of profit, right, that takes from you in case you need to go to spend the night somewhere. So it's like a four-day deal, and you have to spend the night during the week. In the case like that, we're not going to be trying to stay at the Four Seasons. We're going to say, we can stay at the Marriott or the Hilton or whatever. One of the problems that I see with certain athletes where they're signed and they go and buy a house immediately in that area. When do you know it's gone? What do you do once it's over?
I think that's where you're seeing the phenomenon of a lot of people going broke. They're not able to maintain these residences, this lifestyle, some of the material things that they've purchased at the beginning of their contracts or career. They're forced to sell these things, especially if it's recently, at a lower depreciated rate because the markets in our financial landscape has been so sullen lately. And you're out cold. You're out in the cold. You don't have the means to sustain what you thought was the lifestyle you'd have because it was an unreal expectation going into it. And without the proper supervision in a lot of these leech professions, agents only make money off athletes. The financial guys make money off of having the clientele. They're not necessarily generating the stuff themselves. They're just showing you how to manage it for a fee. And they may necessarily, because they're trying to amass as many clients as possible, you hope that they're concerned about you and your personal situation to the extent that they would be concerned about themselves. But that's rarely the case. I think they're all trying to accumulate as much business as possible, get their money and their fees. And the athlete, a lot of times, is left out in the cold, not having the full knowledge base on how to take care of himself in this financial world that we live in.
When you work in a company, you normally get some type of notice. And with athletes, what tends to happen is, especially if they're undrafted or they get released and then they get signed again, and the next week they go through these different types of cycles. I mean, what tends to happen to them when they're continuously chasing the check? Because that's really what they're doing. So one week they don't get a check, the next week they do. I mean, how does that work?
Well, I think it's a very tenuous lifestyle. It's very unstable. You have to understand, from an athlete perspective, we've probably always been the best at what we did at our respective schools, colleges, maybe former places of employment. Now you may be put into a track where you're expendable. And mentally, it's hard to transition from, man, I used to be the man, I was the best guy doing whatever it is I'm doing. Now I'm kind of fighting to have a job. My contracts at each place, if I keep getting released and picked up, are diminishing. They're getting less and less, more in line with what the minimums would be. And you can't start planning your finance. Like, somebody like that can't, in my opinion, thoroughly plan their financial future as well, considering the nature of professional sports, and then having to exist until you're, the average, like 75-year lifespan. So you really have to kind of put yourself on pause, be disciplined enough not to or minimize your expenses for living as much as you possibly can, and wait it out and see what's going to happen. But then there's also that auspice of keeping up with the Joneses that these athletes go through, where you don't want to look like you're the bum or the broke guy on the team, which is, a personal self-esteem issue or an insecurity that you have to overcome in order to make that proper business plan that's indicative of succeeding after whatever your professional athletic sports career is going to determine for you.
Right. So you mentioned that usually you're the best at what you do.
Or have been,
relatively speaking. There's the cheap labor, and then there's the real labor. And with all the companies now outsourcing to India, Malaysia, and Philippines, what ends up happening is the people that used to make the amount of money, they kind of get shortcutted for the people of the lower salaries, right?
Definitely.
So it's the same thing with athletes, because if you're a vested veteran, right, you go to the next team, you'll get what you would normally get as a vested veteran, but you're not going to get the same amount that you used to get, because there's a 26-year-old or a 24-year-old that could probably play your same position better and cheaper.
Definitely, if that person exists, because when you get to the professional sports arena, it's professional business. There's not just the sports side of it, it's the business side. And if a company can minimize its expenses by finding someone, they would outsource it to India and Indonesia if they could play ball.
Right.
But they can't. So luckily, you do have a place of employment. But as you get older and your skills diminish on the field, you're going to be paid less. And you're even more at risk to be cut, because the league minimums for veterans are higher, because our union fought for those type of things. But now it's like, well, why would I hire a 10-year veteran who I have to pay $1 million to, when I can get that 23-year-old guy who I can pay $250,000 to, and for I can get 4 or 5 players for that price of that one guy under my salary cap. So you're at risk. And that's why it becomes more crucial to save as much money as you can, as early as you can, and manage your party schedule a little bit better, so that your next generation is doing well as a result of you playing football, instead of worrying about getting the rims and the chain and the bling right now.
Well, you can minimize your party bus trips, because it's volatile. It's definitely volatile.
Definitely.
And I mean, it sounds like something also that you can be taught in a college setting. If you're an athlete in college and you don't make it to the league, or you can't play overseas, or you can't play in the Canadian Football League, I mean, having that financial literacy at college to help you understand what you need to do with any profession that you have, I think is very important.
And it's a shame that it's not, the educational process does not support the fact that professional sports is a multi-billion-dollar business. So educational parameters are not set up or indicative of what that lifestyle could possibly be if you're doing something else other than playing ball. I mean, I think it's definitely a necessity for the athletes who play to have that educational, that intellectual background to sustain themselves and their lifestyles far beyond their careers. But there are so many people who desire to be a part of sports who don't necessarily take the time to become educated or are experientially educated. They're majoring in other things to make sure that they can be a part of it, but the athlete suffers because he or she is not being educated on how to best preserve their own livelihoods, in college, And when you're learning the trial and error route, it takes so much longer to get to a point where now I know what I'm doing. And by that time, you're that 34-year-old guy who's on the way out anyway, and you've blown so much of your money up to that point that now you're hopefully trying to stay off that 30 for 30 broke list.
I think athletes should build a business plan before they go into any professional sport.
And I think colleges should create programs that help to educate them on how to do that.
I'm Temeko Richardson.
And I'm Tre Johnson.
And we'll see you next time.